We are coming to the heart of the program, and this portion of the program is really what excited me about attending tonight's banquet. This story grabbed my attention, not just now when the book came out this year, but years ago. Years ago, I was preparing for a Jummah khutbah at the Islamic Center, and I heard this story, and it grabbed me. It touched my heart. I was inspired, and I shared this incredible story at a Jummah khutbah many years ago, and now it's a book. There's going to be a movie. I don't want to give everything away, but it's really become an incredible, compelling story that is reaching the hearts and minds of millions in this country. To introduce our main speaker, our keynote speaker, and the topic of the true American, we have a short video. Following the short video, we will have a conversation with the author of the book, and finally, the keynote address by the subject of the book, Rais Bhuiyan. So please join me in watching this video, and we'll continue our program thereafter. Thank you.
I'd actually spent kind of a year and a half looking for some sort of story to tell about the American dream and what was happening to it. This story scrambles everything you think. One of them is an immigrant from Bangladesh who comes to America wanting to get in on the IT revolution. The other is a product of a kind of ailing white working class in Texas.
The gunman came to the store, pointing a gun directly at my face, and I begged him not to shoot me. And I realized that he is not here for money.
I did what I thought I had to do. I did what every other American wanted to do, but didn't have the nerve.
Shoots him point blank range. It was very hard to argue that he had a chance to be much different than what he became. Abuse from the youngest days. Wrestled with meth and wrestled with being in and out of prison. This man is scheduled to be executed in Texas. In his final days, his victim has been fighting to save his life.
I didn't want him to die. I looked at him as a human being like me. His execution will not eradicate hate crimes from this world. We will simply lose a human life without dealing with the root cause.
He got an exposure to another America, and he didn't like the fact that there was this undernation of hurting people beneath the fortunate country he had accessed. And he decides that publicly forgiving this man and then fighting to save his life would not only be the right thing for that man and for him, but would invite a dialogue in this country about the power of mercy instead of revenge.
Once he found peace, forgiveness, compassion from the person whom he tried to kill, he became a changed person.
My split second of hate and anger after 9/11 has caused many people lifetimes of pain, and I regret that.
One was just this story of attempted murder and forgiveness. But beneath that was really a story of these two Americas, a thriving one and a failing one, which kind of often stay apart, but brutally collided in this story. It was the Muslim immigrant from the third world who actually was able to access the America that still worked, because after being shot, he rebuilt his life in this extraordinary way. And it was the Texan born in America who actually, when you dug into it, belonged to an America that stopped working a long time ago. It's the Muslim man who's seeking mercy, and the Muslim man who argues that the Quran compels him to the belief that taking a life is like taking all lives, and saving one life is like saving all mankind.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming warmly Salam El-Mariyati and Anand Giridharadas.
Thank you very much. Anand, it's great to have you with us today. I thought we'd just have a conversation about your book. The book is called The True American, Murder and Mercy in Texas. And obviously the first thing many people think about is, well, who is the true American? And this book is about Rais-ud-Din Bhuiyan, who's with us, and he'll be introduced by Congressman Adam Schiff after this. What made you decide to do a story about Rais?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me here. You know, one of the challenges for a writer is to bridge big stories with small stories. And what I mean by that is the things that matter most are the kind of great stories of our time. For example, in this case, I was consumed by the idea that the American dream had stopped working for an enormous number of people, even as for another set of people, it was working better than any country's dream had ever worked, and better than it had ever worked here in history. And so that was the big idea. But I just already gave you that big idea, so it's not a book. You have to find a small story, a group of people, a situation that's human, to explore the idea and to kind of share it with people in a way that gets at people's hearts rather than just their head. And so I kind of had that big idea swirling for a while and thought of a million different ways of writing different books that would have explored that kind of two Americas story. And then one day I see in the newspaper this brief saying that there was this case in Texas and a guy was going to be executed. So far, not really news. And then the last part of the news brief was a man by the name of Raisuddin Bhuiyan, living in Texas, that started to be a little more interesting news, was fighting to save this guy's life in the name of Islam. And suddenly I just wanted to know more. And usually when you want to know more, it's a little bit of a hint that maybe other people will want to know more too. That was 9 a.m. By 11 a.m. that day, I called out to my wife from the study and said, I have the next book.
The book is not just about Raisuddin. It's about another man named Mark Stroman. Mark Stroman, a white supremacist, is the one who shot Rais in the face. What made you decide to do a book that talks about both of their lives?
You know, so you heard a little bit in the video, but you essentially have this man, Mark Stroman, who was a sort of part-time white supremacist, you could say, and who had a hard life, drifted in and out of work, drifted in and out of prison, drifted in and out of the lives of the children he'd fathered, and goes crazy after 9/11 with rage and commits these shootings. Two of the people died, two of the convenience store clerks. And because Race survived, and because Race 10 years later made an attempt not only to forgive Stroman but to save his life, their lives became juxtaposed in this amazing way. And each of them is worth a book, a story. Each of them tells us something. But to me, it was the juxtaposition of these two men as claimants to something fundamentally American that was very powerful. And so race represents this claim that to be an American is to be part of an ethic more than an identity. Doesn't matter where you came from, it matters what you believe and that you're here and that you're ready to go and open for reinvention. And but there's also another claim. And that claim can be ugly and it can be expressed in perhaps less ugly terms too. But it's a claim about preserving what's already here rather than letting in new blood. And there are some circumstances where there's a case to be made for preserving. But in the case of Mark Stroman, it was a very radical, fanatical, fundamentalist version of that claim, which was that America was perfect as it was, white, Christian, kind of a country of hamburgers and motorcycles and naked women, as he once put it, and that people like Raisuddin and the two people he shot besides him were ruining it. And so I wanted to explore the collision of these two claims, and that's how I started. But when I got into the story, I realized there was another collision, which was actually, even though Raisuddin was the victim in the beginning of this story, in some ways, as you watch his life evolve from the moment of the shooting, and 10 years of evolution to the point where he is today, working up through jobs at the Olive Garden and then learning IT through some guy who knew a guy, and then getting jobs in IT and then running his division. race was actually part of a story, not of victimhood, but of an America that still actually remarkably worked. And Mark Stroman, who began this story as the guy on the aggressor end of the gun, actually, as you went deeper and deeper, became a kind of victim. It was Mark Stroman who, as race came to see with the largeness of his heart, had never had an opportunity at an American dream and at reinvention that race had had. And it was just kind of wonderfully complicated, and I wanted to explore it.
Now, both men go through a transformation, and I think you write about their transformations wonderfully. It's riveting. Explain to us, how did Rais go through the transformation? Because his dream of being a pilot was obviously destroyed when he was shot, and his vision was impaired. He lost his dream of marrying his sweetheart back in Bangladesh because he was considered impaired in terms of his vision. And so, how did he go through a transformation? And how did Mark Stroman go through a transformation?
So the period between this act of violence and the act of forgiveness is exactly 10 years. And both, as you say, are stories of transformation. So, Race's transformation begins with simple recovery and triage, and he's sent to a hospital, and from the first moment he's sent to the hospital, he starts experiencing the kind of underside of the American dream. So he's sent to this hospital. The next day they let him out, even though his eye is still shut and caked black with blood. You saw that photograph. Even though he can't really speak. And he thinks, I'm in a really rich country, and this seems like a pretty good hospital, so maybe they know something I don't, and maybe, despite all appearances, I'm okay. But he wasn't okay. He was sent out because he didn't have health insurance, and being shot in the face was a pre-existing condition. So out you go. He was later then billed up to $60,000 for various surgeries, including a line item for a 911 phone call fee that was made on his behalf. So his life his 10-year period begins at that very low point through $60,000 of debt, through slowly healing, being homeless, losing the fiance, to a place of then rebuilding and of getting jobs. And it's also a story about immigrant friends and others who helped, who lent couches to sleep on, who gave job tips. Then he gets to the Olive Garden. The Olive Garden is kind of in the middle of this book, and it's one of my favorite parts of the book because it's a little bit of comic relief in what's otherwise a slightly serious thing. And so Race gets a job at the Olive Garden. And I remember when he was telling me this, I was just thinking, this is such a wonderful story because he realizes something some of you may relate to while you are not enjoying your wine tonight, that at the Olive Garden, if you don't serve alcohol as a waiter, you're foregoing 50% of your possible earnings, which is a lot of money. And so he had to make a decision. Do I follow my faith in a very strong way and forego half of my income? Or do I, keep the rules for myself but serve it to others? And he kind of had this moment where he says, well, I don't think God would want me to starve, so, there's flexibility. And this is the moment where he became, I think, in my mind, an American Muslim, pragmatic.
Well, not all American Muslims do that, but yes.
Right. But he was pragmatic.
Right.
He was dealing with the new realities of the world in which he found himself, a country that he was still learning to navigate. And from there is able to get to IT classes, IT part-time jobs, IT full-time jobs. In that same 10-year period, Mark Stroman, perhaps less outwardly, is going through a dramatic metamorphosis of his own. And it's very different. It's a metamorphosis of actually being alone. When you're on death row, as he was, 23 hours a day in solitude in your cell, 1 hour of recreation. And there alone, he goes deep within himself and has the power to reflect, finds God, finds this pattern of hurt or be hurt that had dominated his life from the earliest days of his abuse, and is able to get to a place where, when Race forgave him, 10 years after the shooting, he was able to receive it and honor it. And finally, they have a conversation on the day of the scheduled execution 10 years later in which he calls Race his bro. He says, "I love you, bro."
That was also a time where Race, go ahead. That was also a time when Race, through the help of some lawyers, filed a motion with the Texas State Supreme Court. And I believe Rick Perry was the Attorney General at the time. Governor at the time. And Race says that the Islamic Sharia gives him the right, based on his First Amendment, therefore, the Islamic Sharia gives him the right to forgive Mark. And therefore, the court should respect that right as the victim. And so is the Islamic Sharia of forgiveness against the Texas death penalty law.
You know, this is also a very interesting part of the story, and filled with the kind of ironies that make a writer have something to do. And so it begins with Race, as you say exactly, arguing. You know, he made many arguments because you have to in these kinds of cases. But one of his arguments was that as a Muslim, he has not just a right but a duty to forgive. And that the eye for an eye passage has a semicolon, there's a whole other clause afterwards, and it's about forgiveness. And so, as a Muslim, he has an obligation. And then as an American, which he had become 2 years before this case, he says, I have a religious freedom to practice my obligation to forgive. Now, the Supreme Court has not held in Race's favor on the legal merits of that argument, but it was a powerful moral and rhetorical argument. The best part of this whole thing, and getting to the delicious irony, so Race is filing these briefs in court and has his lawyers writing those briefs. Meanwhile, Mark Stroman is having his lawyers file their own briefs, arguing directly for his own life, whereas Race was kind of arguing from the side. And Mark Stroman's lawyers must have seen Race's briefs and been very impressed, because at some point in Mark Stroman's brief, Mark Stroman, too, gets on the record calling for the application of Sharia law in the Texas courts of law.
Okay, I got to do it now. I can't wait till the end. You got to get the book. It's out in the lobby. Everybody should get 5 copies and give it to your friends and families and make it a Christmas gift in this holiday season. I think everybody should get copies of this book and start circulating it. I'm sorry, I had to make a commercial.
And that's great if you do that. And more importantly, though, than getting the book, I need your help in talking to people about it. People who are not in this room, people who are maybe of the Muslim faith, people who are maybe not of the Muslim faith, but are your friends and your contact and your colleagues. Because precisely for the reasons that attracted me to this story, the fact that it scrambles stereotypes, that the terrorist in the story is a white guy named Mark, and the practitioner of mercy is a Muslim American, it's hard to fit into what people expect. And so I need you to, whether it's on Facebook or whatever else, we need to tell this story, and Race's story, and also Mark's story.
Yeah.
Because these are both stories of our American reality that are too often undertold.
There are a lot of Americas that you talk about in this book, and one of them is the America of people in the lower class who are basically, their whole environment is about drugs, is about stealing so that they can make ends meet, is about going to prison and then becoming hardened criminals after going to prison. And that's the life of Mark Stroman. What is it about that America that you want to tell our audience?
You know, I think I didn't want this to just be Race is a wonderful guy, and you could do many books on just this amazing story of his resilience. But I felt that would have limited it, because I don't think there are 100,000 races in America, unfortunately. But there are a lot of people like Mark Stroman in America. And I don't mean people who want to go around killing Muslims. There's probably a very small number, thankfully, of that. But the larger patterns that Mark Stroman represented, the family dysfunction, the abuse, the alcoholism, the meth addiction, the prison system, well, the school system, first of all, the school to prison pipeline that people talk about. He was a poster child for that. Every time he has contact with law enforcement and the prison system, he's done something wrong, he goes into their care and he comes out worse. Bad parents, and then parents who become bad parents to their own children. All of it represented a failure that, when juxtaposed with Race's life and Race's attitudes to family, to community, was so striking. And I partly was able to use not my own view of Mark Stroman, but Race's view, because Race goes to the trial of the guy who shot him and learns about his family. And then he's fighting this campaign, so he learns more. And as Race learns about the world that made the guy who shot him, he's appalled. But it's not just when he learns about Mark. When Race works at the Olive Garden, he's appalled. And I'm going to tell you one little example, because to me this is actually much more widespread. One thing that really struck Race at the Olive Garden was that a lot of his colleagues walked an hour and a half on the side of the highway, including pregnant women, high July heat. And he was wondering, why don't these people have cars? Can they not afford a lease? But he knew the salary. The salary was enough to support leasing a car. And he realized they had the money to lease cars. They didn't have people in their lives who would co-sign a lease with them. And he thought, I'm an immigrant, and I have this friend and this contact who will co-sign a lease for him, and had. And he was amazed that he'd come to this country where native-born Americans were so deprived of, what scholars call social capital, that they could not access what he was starting to be able to access despite what had happened to him. And so I really wanted to shine a light on that world too, because that world is part of what made the hate. It doesn't excuse the hate, but it's part of what made the hate. But also, the victim of that hate is such a powerful antidote to that poverty, dysfunction, and chaos.
Well, this is considered by the New York Times as the 100 most notable books of 2014, so congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And they're going to make a movie out of this book, so we're looking forward to that, and we have what we call the...
Are you planning to audition?
No, but we have what's called the MPAC Media Awards, so we might re-invite you and whoever's going to make the film and Reese to that as well. So this is great. I think it's one of the best stories, and if we want to counter negative stereotypes about Muslims, we have to find these positive stories and push these positive stories out. It really is up to us. So I think you've done us a big favor by giving us a tool, the true American. That true American is Reis Bhuiyan. So thank you, Anand, for doing that.
Thank you, and thank all of you.